Ben Shapiro is editor-in-chief of Daily Wire and host of The Ben Shapiro Show, the top conservative podcast in the nation. Shapiro is the author of 7 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Bullies: How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences America. His newest book, The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great, comes out a week from today. A graduate of UCLA and Harvard Law School, Shapiro became the youngest nationally syndicated columnist at age 17 and has not stopped since. Rush Limbaugh says Shapiro isn't just content to have people be dazzled by his brilliance, he actually goes out and confronts and tries to persuade, mobilize, and motivate people. Glenn Beck calls Shapiro a warrior for conservatism, against those who use fear and intimidation to stifle honest debate. I've never known him to back down from a fight. Just 3 years ago, Ben spoke at the University of Michigan for the first time, and we are happy to have him back today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to welcome to the stage Ben Shapiro.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. What an amazing showing, what an amazing crowd. Thank you so much for coming out tonight in the midst of what we in Los Angeles call hell weather. It really is impressive. Apparently there were another 6,000 people on the wait list for this event. So there is obviously a market for conservatism here at University of Michigan. The title of this lecture is "The Government is the Bully." I think the truth of that statement is pretty self-evident. Government is, in essence, a giant gun. It is a giant force for compulsion. Government inherently is backed by compulsion. Otherwise, it would just be a voluntary association. It would be, as Democrats like to think of it, the things we do together. It is the things we do together also backed by a gun. Well, sometimes compulsion is justified. I'm not an anarchist. Very few people are. Sometimes government compulsion is justified. Determining when government compulsion is justified is really the difference between various political points of view in the United States and also in Europe. In sort of classical Enlightenment, or Enlightenment theory, apparently, the Hobbesian view of government was that rights come from government. Without government, we would all destroy each other, life would be nasty, brutish, and short, and thus government had the ability to invade our rights at any time, since we required a Leviathan to protect us from one another. So there was no such thing as an illegitimate use of government power. The government was there. It created our rights. We owe our rights to the government, so wherever the government decided to use compulsion was appropriate. The Lockean notion of government is the notion of government upon which the United States is essentially based. And that notion is that there are natural rights that pre-exist government, that these rights come from nature or from nature's God, as it's expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and that these rights include the rights to life, liberty, and property. The Lockean belief is that in a state of nature, meaning pre-existing government, we formed communities, groups of families, in order to protect those rights, and then eventually we delegated protection of those rights to the government. If governments were to invade those rights, then the compulsion would become illegitimate. So go through each of those briefly. Life. The government has been delegated the enforcement, obviously, of the right to life. This means the prosecution of criminals. It means the provision for the mutual defense. It means that the government does have the capacity to tax for police use so as to ensure that our lives are protected. It also means that government has the ability to protect all lives, the unborn included, which is why when you hear the quote-unquote libertarian argument against the pro-life position, that doesn't make a lot of sense. If you believe that there is life to be protected, then the government obviously has a role in protecting that life, whether it is inside or outside the womb. One of the greatest flaws in all of human history is humanity's unique ability to define a way inconvenient human life. Whether we are talking about slaves in the United States or across the world, or Jews during the Holocaust, or the unborn. That would be government abdicating and overthrowing its most fundamental duty. Okay, liberty is supposed to be protected by government, and sometimes that requires the use of compulsion. The government was designed to protect your freedoms, not to invade them. So the government is supposed to protect people from, for example, enslaving you. In the Lockean view, liberty was defined as freedom from, not freedom to, meaning that it wasn't that the government was supposed to provide you all sorts of resources. It was that you were free in a state of nature without anybody else imposing their will on you. That's what liberty was defined as. In sort of modern political parlance, we call these negative liberties. This was the founding idea of liberty. Liberty involved not being restricted by government or anyone else from fulfilling your purpose so long as you didn't harm anyone else. The only question of government compulsion was really about externalities, meaning you do something, it affects a third party, and now it's government's job to come in and stop you because you get to wave around your hand until you hit somebody in the face. At that point, you've invaded their liberty. Now, the modern left has suggested that freedom is actually about something else. Freedom from want. The freedom to have the sort of health care that you want. The freedom of receiving an income, whether you are unable or, in the words of AOC, unwilling to work, which is a theory that has yet to be proved out anywhere on earth successfully. But that is not freedom. That is excising from, that is taking from others, since these goods do not exist automatically. If you say you have a right to a product, that means that you have a right to compel somebody to make that product for you. That's a very different idea of what liberty is than what the founders thought, which is that you have a right to be free from the compulsion of others. Okay, finally, property in the Lockean vision. So John Locke and the founding fathers believed that property was basically your labor, that your labor was an extension of your innate creative capacity as a human being made in God's image. Land ownership, for example, came from mixing your labor with the land. Capital was merely labor in another form. It was the script that we use when we trade with one another as shorthand. I owe you X hours of labor. That's all that money is. Right? The government is empowered to protect your individual creative capacity from the encroachment of others. It is empowered to stop other people from stealing your property. The government is also empowered to protect your property from externalities and to protect the commons from externalities. Right? This is where environmental regulation would come in. Somebody's not allowed to simply pump toxic waste onto your property. That is them damaging you. And that's true if you have a commonly held piece of property. You have a common waterway. People aren't allowed to simply pump toxic sludge in there. The Lockean vision of government would allow government compulsion to stop that sort of thing. Okay, with all of that said, what does that say about taxes in this sort of conservative point of view? There are some folks who say all taxation is theft. Well, most taxation is theft. Okay, some taxation is not. Taxation is theft when it is not part of the bigger bargain, the essential contract we forged with the government to protect our life, liberty, and property. In other words, when two people vote to take a third guy's money and then distribute it among themselves, that is obviously theft. And it's theft because it's backed by the government gun, and it is theft because it is compulsion, whether or not people voted for it. If a majority votes to remove the rights of a minority, that is still tyranny. The founders were deeply concerned about the tyranny of the majority. How about equality before the law? This is the innate notion that we are all created in God's image, and it means that we must be treated equally under the law. That does not mean that the effect of every law is equal, of course. So government compulsion is supposed to take place at the level of the objective, meaning that everybody is supposed to be treated the same by the law. But that does not mean the effect of every law on everybody is equal. Obviously, it is not. We all have different drives. We all have different motivations. Some of us have more of a drive to steal things. That does not mean that we are supposed to go easy on those of us who have more of a drive to steal things. Government is capable of using compulsion, again, in the situations mentioned before. Whenever people are trying to encroach on life, liberty, or property, that's when the government gets involved. Okay, so when isn't government justified? When does government become the bully? When government is activated to invade the rights of other people, even for the purported good of the many. That's when the government is the bully. And that is what we are seeing increasingly these days. The call for socialism, in essence, is a call to invade the rights of others on behalf of yourself or on behalf of the greater good. Folks who portray socialism as inherently altruistic are full of it. Socialism is not inherently altruistic. Socialism is about sticking your hand in somebody else's pocket because you voted to do so. That is not altruistic. It is not kind. It is not decent. It is not just. Free markets are kind, decent, and just because they are predicated on a basic notion, which is that you are an individual. You own your own labor. You are capable of running your own life. You're capable of exercising your reason, and nobody has the capacity to steal things from you just because they feel it's unfair that you've been successful in some way. On economics, the government is empowered only to protect property. It is not empowered to protect some at the expense of others. It is not empowered to take. Okay, this gives the lie to the notion that you keep hearing that billionaires are inherently immoral. You've heard this, again, from AOC. Well, one of the wonderful things about AOC, just as a human being, is that she's a great teaching tool, AOC, because she really does simplify all of the most complex ideas of the left down to inane bumper stickers. And also she dances, so there's that. She has a few great qualities. Dances, can mix a drink, says inane things. It's pretty spectacular. One of the things she is fond of saying is that billionaires are not inherently, that billionaires are inherently immoral. which sort of requires you to ask the question, at what point does the billionaire become immoral? So when the billionaire is worth $999,999,999, they are not immoral. When they earn $2 more, suddenly they are deeply immoral. It's that final transaction. It's the sale of that millionth hamburger that changes them. They went from being a kind, decent human being who hires tens of thousands of people to being the scum of the earth, predicated simply on that one transaction. So if they can hold themselves back from selling the Big Mac, then they can still enter the kingdom of heaven. If, however, they do not, then they have obviously acted immorally. The belief that undergirds all of this is, of course, that voluntary transactions are in fact exploitative. That if you and I agree that you're going to work for a wage and I'm going to pay you the wage, that somehow I have exploited you. Or if I agree to sell you a product and you decide to buy the product, that somehow I have exploited you. Billionaires did not get rich by screwing the poor. They did not get rich by screwing the poor. Billionaires in a free society, in socialist societies, billionaires get rich by screwing the poor. Right? Hugo Chavez gets rich by totally screwing the poor. Stalin lived in a really, really nice dacha because he screwed the poor. You can get rich in a socialist society by removing everybody's wealth, including the wealth of the poor, and killing all the kulaks. There you can become super wealthy super easily. It is good to be the dictator of a socialist society. But if you're a billionaire in a free society, then you became a billionaire because you involved yourself in an enormous number of voluntary transactions that bettered both sides, in which both people involved themselves on a voluntary basis. That is a good thing. That is inherently better than anything that we are talking about in terms of government compulsion. When AOC talks about how it's immoral for Jeff Bezos to be a billionaire, running a corporation that makes all of our lives incredibly easy, and also employing, by the way, legitimately hundreds of thousands of people, all I can say is it seems a lot more immoral for AOC to try and come down hard on Jeff Bezos and regulate him into the ground or remove all of his money simply out of pure, disgusting jealousy. Free markets create prosperity. They are inherently moral. She called capitalism irredeemable like 2 days ago. Irredeemable. You mean the system of markets that has raised legitimately 80% of the world's population from the worst form of abject poverty since 1980. That's irredeemable, according to AOC. Populists on both the right and the left seem to believe that it is their job to treat the market as a tool. That means they can rejigger the market using compulsion. That the market's just something that serves us. The market was not created by human hands from the top down. The market is just a recognition that you are an individual and you have a capacity to run your own life. That's all the free market is. Redistributionism is compulsion. It is not the job of government. Caring for the poor is primarily the job of the social fabric, which we'll talk about in a little while. If it is the job of government, it is the job of local government as a backstop. Government is not positioned nor designed to morally right cosmic injustices, nor is it effective in doing so. We have dumped $22 trillion into war on poverty programs over the last 40 years in this country. And there are just as many people under the poverty line in the United States as there were when we started. The government is not positioned to reset history. The government is not positioned to change all disparities. That's just not what the government is for. The government is there to ensure that we don't harm each other. The rules have to be equal, but that doesn't mean that the outcome has to be equal, because the outcome is never going to be equal, ever. The outcome is never equal. It's not equal in socialist countries either. In full-on USSR land, it was not equal. Some people got shot, some people got gulagged, and some people got dachas. Outcomes are not equal, and government is not in a position to make outcomes equal. All government can do is make sure that the rules are evenly applied. Okay, it is government compulsion if the government decides to violate your right to associate with whom you choose. One of the things the left wants to do is suggest that the government gets to tell you who you can hang out with, who you have to do business with, who you have to go to school with. This is an inherent violation of your natural rights. You do not get to compel other people to hang out with you. This is something we all learned in second grade and then forgot if we're leftists. In second grade, you'd be, oh, that cool kid, I wish I could hang out with him. And then you have your parents call their parents, and then everything gets real awkward. And then you realize, oh, I can't compel that kid to hang out with me. I was on that end of the equation. And then you learn you're not allowed to do that to people, unless you're on the left, in which case you say, you know what would be great if we can force the cool kid to hang out with the uncool kid through the force of government. Except it won't just be hanging out. It will be forcing people to do business in a certain way. It will be forcing people to run their churches in a certain way, run their schools in a certain way, run their lives in a certain way. Now, right now, there are a lot of folks who are on the left who are probably thinking, well, I know what he's talking about. What he's probably talking about here is, the religious baker who doesn't want to cater to the same-sex wedding. And I am talking about that. That is true. I do not believe that you have the capacity to compel a person to do business with you. But I am also talking about a system of government that did compel you not to do business with certain people. That was a system called Jim Crow. It was governmentally imposed from the top down. Your business would be fined or shut down in Jim Crow, Alabama, if you seeded blacks and whites together, even if you wanted to. In other words, once the government starts compelling association, things get very ugly very quickly, because then it's just a question of who gets to wield the power. When it comes to government compulsion, the question is not whether the government is the gun. The question is who gets to control the gun. And you might think right now, great, I get to control the gun. But tomorrow, it's going to be somebody else who gets to control that gun. So you better determine what you want the range of the gun to be, whether you want it to be loaded, what you want the capacity of the gun to be. Otherwise, you're turning over a weapon to an impersonal group of people who could use it against you tomorrow. On education, the government does not have a role in compulsory education. Okay, the government has a role when it comes to protecting children, because children cannot protect themselves. But the government does not have a role in deciding what parents must teach their children as a general rule. The government cannot tell you that you must teach X, Y, and Z social values to your child. Because guess what? The government is not properly positioned to do that. You are a parent. You have rights over your child. Now, if you are endangering your child, if you are doing something inherently dangerous to your child, that is a different story. Children need to be protected in the same way anyone else needs to be protected from the predations of others. But the notion of top-down education, forced by the state, by people who control from the top down, is inherently dangerous. This is also true when it comes to government subsidizing education. Government is not in the business of taking money from some people to pay for your tuition. It should not be. Hey, I understand we're at a public university. Tough. I went to a public university too. I understand. It's great. Low tuition, the whole deal. But let's be real about something. People facilitating your ability to major in gender studies is a form of compulsion. If you were really majoring in something useful, you could get a private loan to do so. This applies to everyone, virtually everyone in the humanities. I know, I was a humanities major. Okay, there are certain majors that will be easier for you to get a loan. There will be certain majors where it will be not as easy for you to get a loan. Okay, that's okay. That's the market. That's voluntarism. But saying that you're going to compel somebody else to pay for your tuition because you have decided to major in something you couldn't get a private loan for, I'm sorry, not my business to pay for your personal fulfillment. I did not volunteer to do so, and neither did anyone else. Finally, personal habits when it comes to compulsion. Government should not be in the business of either subsidizing personal habits or compelling personal habits. Now, there's certain areas here where folks on the left are right on board, where we all agree. Right? I don't think the government should be in the business of regulating sexual activity. I don't think that the government should be in the business of regulating consensual drugs that don't impact others. This is why I'm for decriminalization. Marijuana, for example. National Review, by the way, has been for decriminalization of marijuana for legitimately decades. I don't believe that the government should be in the business of regulating the food you eat or drink, or the size of your home, or how many hamburgers you can eat, AOC. This also means that I don't think that the government should be in the business of compelling you to buy a certain level of health care. If you wish to buy a certain level of health care, that is your business. If you do not wish to buy a certain level of health care, that is your business too. And then the question becomes, you get to pay the effects of that. A voluntary society means you feel the effects of all of your decisions. Now, what we've seen typically is the left accept some of these premises, but then expand the definition of externality. So instead of acknowledging the reality, which is that government is compulsion, and that there is tyranny that is taking place on a governmental level, instead what the left will do is say, no, we're not engaging in tyranny. What we're trying to do is stop externalities. And so what you'll hear from the left very often is that everything is an externality. Virtually everything is a form of externality. So for example, speech has externalities. If I say something, it's a form of violence. I'm sure protesters outside are saying exactly that right now. So for example, if I say that there is such a thing as a biological male and a biological female, this, they say, is a form of violence. It's a microaggression. It has externalities, therefore I should be stopped from talking. They will say that everything in the world is has environmental externalities. You driving a car, you flying a plane, you eating cows, right? All of these things have externalities, and therefore it's up to government to regulate every aspect of your life. And to a certain extent that is true. As human beings living in the world, of course there are externalities. The question is, at what point does it become an actual damaging thing to others? And then what you will see is the expansion of the externalities discussion to even suggest that you are responsible for things for which you are not responsible. This is the discussion that is currently taking place with regard to, for example, slavery reparations. The idea being that there were externalities from slavery that took place 170 years ago, and that those externalities are somehow applicable to you, that somehow you are responsible for those externalities, and so slavery reparations are on the table. Well, what you're talking about in reality is confiscating from some people and giving to other people on the basis of a sin that was not committed by the people from whom you are confiscating. Here's the truth. The entire system of American government that was built on this basic premise that government was created to protect life, liberty, and property and not to invade life, liberty, and property. That entire system has to be undergirded by something else, because what the left will say is that there are too many people out there who won't be taken care of, too many people who will fall through the cracks. It's not compassionate. Compassion doesn't have to come in the form of government. In fact, compassion coming in the form of government is the worst form of compassion. Compassion coming in the form of government typically does require compulsion. It requires force. Compassion coming in the form of a social fabric that matters, that's what heals society. If you look at the areas of the United States that are most left behind right now, the ones that are suffering most economically, the ones where the opioid epidemic is really taking a lot of lives, those are the areas where social institutions, I'm not talking about government. Government is very active in a lot of these areas. I'm talking about social institutions. I'm talking churches. I'm talking schools. I'm talking parental associations. I'm talking about social institutions that have always undergirded the American bargain have disappeared. If you want to heal America, then we need to get together in non-governmental situations. We need to get together and we need to form a social framework without government forcing people to do so. And inherently good people can be a freer people. That's what needs to be restored. We can have freedom and prosperity and compassion. And for most of American history, not only have we done that, we have grown the bargain. We have expanded it to new people. But if we move toward compulsion, instead of moving toward a restoration of American values and the American soul, the American social fabric, what we will end up with is a government too big for anyone to control, and a government that in essence ends up controlling all of us. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions.
All right, if you have a question, you can line up back there. Don't come to me first. Go back there where my colleagues are waving. And please keep your questions succinct and short so as many people can answer as possible.
And you all know the rule. If you disagree, raise your hand. You go to the front of the line.
Okay, cool.
That's a long walk, dude. Got your exercise. Good.
Hi, my name is Alam Habib. I'm a senior at U of M. So I was just kind of wondering about your opinion on WikiLeaks and their role in American politics. So are they like a force for good that exposes the truth, or are they kind of like this shadow, creepy organization that's throwing a wrench in everything?
Yeah, I mean, the best intelligence that I've seen suggests that WikiLeaks is a Russian front group, that they're working in conjunction with the Russian government. Now, does that mean that every piece of information that they reveal is non-useful and bad? No, it just means that there is a strategy behind the revelation of this information, and I wouldn't trust WikiLeaks as far as I could throw them. I think that the kind of embrace of WikiLeaks based on the political convenience of what is being said at a given time. So, for example, when WikiLeaks is revealing the supposed nastiness of the American military, the right is very angry at WikiLeaks, and Julian Assange should be prosecuted. And then when WikiLeaks is revealing John Podesta's emails, then WikiLeaks is wonderful and we should cheer them. It's all bullcrap. WikiLeaks is a vicious organization that is effectively a front group for the Russian government.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. I'm a Michigan engineering student.
So a useful person.
Thank you, thank you. So between the time Trump was elected and now, I believe you mentioned that he exceeded your expectations and how conservatively he acted as president. Is there any chance you'd consider voting for him in the 2020 election? Why or why not?
Yeah, I've said that. I'm significantly more likely to vote for him in 2020 than I was in 2016. That's because the math on the ground has changed in a couple of different ways. So I had three main concerns with President Trump before the 2016 election. Concern number one was that I was afraid that President Trump would not govern conservatively because he was all over the place, right? Sometimes it was, we have to ensure there's health care for everyone. No one should die on the street. And then at the same time be like, we're going to get rid of Obamacare. And it was like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. Like, you're on every side of every issue. More positions than the Kama Sutra. And so, I didn't know where he came down on any of those issues. Now I actually have a governing record to go on. So that fear has been mitigated. He passed tax cuts. He has cut regulations. He has rebuilt the American military. He's provided a bevy of judges, including 1.5 good justices. I'm still very torn on Brett Kavanaugh. And he's done a lot of good things that I didn't think he was going to do. So that was concern number one. Concern number two is that he was going to soul suck the Republican Party, that the Republican Party would start defending behavior that they never would have defended before. That's kind of materialized already, meaning that there's stuff that he says that the Republican Party will defend or shy off that they never would have defended or shied off before. And I won't even talk about the personal foibles. I won't even talk about, the fact that he has had 3 wives and cheated on all of them and that, he stoops everything and all that. Like, I'm not even talking about that. What I'm talking about is, for example, him feeling the necessity to say wonderful, kind things about Kim Jong-un. Right? That's something that conservatives never would have been okay with from Barack Obama, and suddenly you're seeing people in the Republican Party kind of winking and nodding at. So that's bad. It's already happened. I don't think that genie is going back in the bottle. And then there was fear number 3, which is that he would poison the Republican brand for young people. I think that's basically true. I think that if you talk to anybody on this campus, probably outside of this room, first of all, we can take a quick poll. How many people in this room, I would say, would grade President Trump an A or a B as president? So that seems about right. About half the audience, right? That's in a largely conservative room, right? You walk outside of this room and you're not even going to get close to that. It'll be 100% against, probably. And that's partially because President Trump's a very polarizing figure because of who he is, because he says things, because he's a hammer in search of a nail. Sometimes he hits a nail, sometimes he hits a baby. The difference is, so I was worried about all of those things. Some of those things have materialized. One of the things I was worried about is that in the future it would make it more difficult for conservatives and Republicans to be elected with President Trump as the guy. I think that fear is still on the table. The difference is it's already materialized, meaning whatever has already happened. So it's not like I'm preventing a future bad should President Trump lose in the next election cycle. I'm not. Everything is now baked into the cake. And let me tell you, it's a weird cake. Right? It's got like custard, but it also has old shoes. It's a weird, but it's all baked into the cake, so that means that I have to assess the realities on the ground. The reality on the ground now is that all the bad stuff about Trump is already out there, it's done, it's a reality. All the good stuff about Trump is out there, it's done, it's reality. And on the other side, you got Bernie Sanders. So that changes the math a bit.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Hi, I'm Jessica. So more and more people are getting their news through personalized feeds on big tech platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Google, and Apple News. And these sites create their own algorithms for disseminating news to every individual who uses their service, and as of today, also control the terms of use for what can be posted and what cannot, as well as who can post.
Capture. This is one of the reasons that I oppose net neutrality, is because places like Google and Facebook were very much in favor of net neutrality so that it would throttle the ability of other companies to get into the business, basically. With all of that said, there is something that should be done and can be done about Twitter and Facebook, and that is that there's an exemption under law for they're essentially treated like common carriers. So Facebook is treated as though it is a platform, not as though it is a publisher. So that what that means is that when you're on Facebook, you can post anything, I can post anything, but the problem is we can't, right? And that's what you're pointing out. Well, I run a website, right, Daily Wire. If we post something that is libelous, we can be sued. If we post something in violation of copyright, we can be sued. Facebook gets to escape all that because they say, well, we're not the ones posting, right? We're just a platform. Anyone can post anything. But if it comes to the point where they're actually exercising editorial control top down and determining what can be posted and what cannot, then they look more like my site and less like a common platform. And that means that they should be open to liability, to encourage them to go back into the business of being a common platform rather than an editorial site that gets to ban things that they don't like.
Thank you.
Hi, Ben. I'm Nick. I'm a student at U of M Dearborn. And I wanted to ask you about a statement you made earlier when you said voluntary decisions can't lead to exploitation. I think that's a little misleading.
Mutually voluntary, yeah.
Because what it assumes is that, you know, even in nominally voluntary, instances, there can't be exploitative behavior. And I get sort of what you're saying. Like, you know, usually when we think of exploitation, we think of, you know, someone being forced or coerced to do something. But, you know, if you take, for example, I mean, I can think of a million examples, but child labor laws, for instance, or the absence of them. When you had, like, children working in factories, for instance, and they're making a voluntary decision to go work in the factory, it seems like the argument carried out to the full conclusion would be, you know, oh, that child needed food for his family, you know, so he made a voluntary decision.
Well, you should be, honestly, I mean, I want to hear a better version of the question, so I'm going to push you not to use child labor laws, the reason being that my basic principle is the same as the principle of all Anglo-American law since the mid-19th century, which is that children are not considered fully rational actors capable of making voluntary decisions. So let's pick an example with an adult.
Okay, so
I think it's a good question, so I want to let's pick.
So the Lochner era of the Supreme Court, which was sort of coming out of the Gilded Age.
Right, I know Lochner, yeah.
Right, where the court basically decided, you know, you have a right to contract, like an employer between an employee, you have a right to contract, and the government can't get involved.
Right.
All right, and you're coming out of an era which is already really rough economically for the United States. You know, people don't have a lot of money, they're not making a lot. And so someone's like, you know, totally at the bottom, and they, you know, make a contract with one of these employers. They're making a decision. They're taking a bad, they're taking the least bad option.
Right.
You know, and that employer might say, hey, you know, you'll work for me, you'll work 80 hours a week,
right,
and I'll pay you $2 an hour. I mean, it's the least bad option, and it's a voluntary decision, but I think it still is exploitative.
Okay, but you know so here's the problem. In seeking to end that exploitation, what you are very often doing is providing them a choice now of no choice. Meaning, for example, let's take up minimum wage law, which is essentially, Lochner is talking about things like minimum wage laws. You're talking about maximum work hours and that sort of thing. So the problem with a minimum wage law is that what you have now done is you've circumscribed choice even further, because you're not actually giving people a broader range of choices. Now you're telling employers that they have to hire people at a certain price. They may think that the employee is not worth the price and just not hire them. And this is what happens very often with minimum wage laws. The solution to all of this is something that I believe in, which is private unionization. So I think the private unionization, you get together with all your friends, you say, listen, none of us are going to work for anything below this wage. We're not allowed to kneecap anybody because that's use of force. But if all of us agree, we're not going to go in, we're not going to work in this place that's going to kill us in 2 years. That's perfectly legitimate and good, right? Collective bargaining on a voluntary basis is a good thing and doesn't violate any free market principles. What I don't like is the idea that if you decide to take a job at $7.50 an hour, and I think that I could have bargained better than you, right? That I could have bargained it up to $10, for example. Or I think that if you had held out a little longer, you might have gotten $10. Or I think that maybe you couldn't have, but you know, the guy can afford $10. You are now imposing your own view of a situation on the actors who are engaging in the act itself. We don't do this in any other area of life. It seems bizarre to me that we would do it in the area of economics.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, Ben, big fan. I'm a sophomore here at Michigan. And basically my question is, one of the big problems that I see with conservatism and where it's going is that we're tending to get away from intellectual conservatism of people like Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman, you know, William Buckley, all that, and we're going to people like Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens, who I just, as a conservative myself, I just don't respect as much. So I was wondering what you think we can do to kind of get back to that intellectual conservatism, because I think that gives it a lot more credibility.
So I'm not going to rip on anybody else in the political space. I'll rip on principles. I'm not going to rip on people. When I make fun of AOC, I'm making fun of her specific views. So you know, so I'm going to follow Reagan's 11th commandment and not attack anybody who's on the same side of the aisle. With that said, would I like to see a more intellectual conservatism that is not focused on slogans and is much more focused on sort of underlying principles? Of course. I mean, I just spent a year and a half writing a book about the principles of Western civilization. It's essentially a survey of Western philosophy since the Bible. So I'm very much a believer in this sort of thing. It's why on my show I recommend a new book nearly every day, or at least once every couple of days. I think a well-read, well-informed conservatism is more convincing than other forms. Listen, conservatism needs all sorts of fighters. It needs people who are able to get the base out and rah-rah, and that's important. It's particularly important come election time. But we also need the capacity to convince. And what that really means is people who have spent a lot of time studying issues, people who are thoughtful about issues, people who can see nuance, who don't suffer from the need to relieve cognitive dissonance. I mean, all of that is useful, but all that takes is it takes a lot more work and a lot more reading, and so that's what I encourage people to do. It's funny, you know, obviously a lot of my personal popularity rests on these 2 minutes Shapiro Destroys videos, and that's all wonderful. I mean, like, that's great. I'm glad people engage with it, But I've always viewed those as more of a gateway drug to something deeper. You know, I want people to watch entire lectures. I want people to go and read entire books. I want people to engage with vaster, broader content. And even when they read my new book, which again is a survey of Western philosophy, I say in the book, there are people who know this stuff way better than I do, so you should go read their books. And life is a constant intellectual journey. If we're not doing that on the right, not only are we failing to make the best arguments, we're also missing out on the fun of politics itself.
Yeah, that was certainly a gateway drug for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Ben. I'm a freshman at U of M. I just have a quick question about abortion. I was wondering, the way you're describing it sounds like killing of babies, whether unborn or born, sounds like a first-degree murder case. I just want to make sure I'm getting that right. Punishment for first-degree murder is life imprisonment without parole. I was wondering if you think people who commit abortions should be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
And doctors, specifically? I mean,
doctors or mothers.
Okay, so the position of the pro-life movement has been for decades that mothers should not be punished for abortion, that women are, at least in part, as much a victim of the abortion as the child. And that springs largely from ignorance about what exactly is being killed. Very few women are actively saying, sure, it's a baby in my womb, take it out. Most of them are saying it's a ball of tissue, it's nothing, it doesn't mean anything. I've been told by Planned Parenthood that it means nothing, so go ahead and perform this polyp surgery. And so that's acting out of ignorance. It lacks the mens rea, and sort of legal terminology that would be necessary in order to establish something like a first-degree murder charge. The same thing does not hold true for Kermit Gosnell. The same thing does not hold true for abortion doctors who are fully aware that a 20-week-old baby is in fact a baby, and who are aware that an incipient human life is in fact an incipient human life. Now, when it comes to gradations of punishment based on the term of the abortion, it's an argument that honestly I haven't considered very much, to be frank with you. Like, I haven't actually sat down and thought about what a criminal code would look like. Is it the same punishment for aborting at 2 weeks as it would be for aborting at 30 weeks? I think, first of all, it would be difficult to establish any sort of public support for a law quite like that. My main issue is not about the punishment so much as it is about the disincentive to the performance of the abortion itself. I'm more interested in preserving the lives as opposed to punishing the people who are taking them. The only reason to punish is to preserve the lives and provide a disincentive. So whatever disincentive was necessary in order to prevent the murder of the unborn, I'm very much in favor of.
Okay, so you said whatever disincentive is necessary. Is there a limit onto what lengths you would go if you were imposing policy to prevent abortion or like?
Yeah, I mean, I said I don't think that a punishment is appropriate for the mother. I think when it comes to abortion doctors who are making their living by killing presumably thousands of unborn children, there are very few lengths to which I think that I would not go in terms of government policy in punishing those doctors and giving them jail time.
Okay. Thank you, Ben.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I really appreciate what you do specifically for the Jewish people as a Kiddush Hashem. It's pretty awesome. I've been delving into slightly the specific food structure currently in the system in the United States. And speaking about kids and life, it's been pretty shocking to see the current system that we have to support nutrition, specifically in public schools, like the fact that it's about $2.60 that's reimbursed per meal, which comes out to about $1 to 90 cents for the actual food. The idea that kids are basically helpless, right? We spoke about that earlier, the idea of being able to support them, not even an adult, but the fact that someone who's growing up between the age of 1 year to 3 years old could have pretty heavy impacts of not having proper nutrition. Other component being the fact that spoke a little bit about how government is not potentially as impactful or powerful as social groups and organizations, and seeing as to how I think in the 70s we actually had the most success of decreasing hunger in the United States, but since it started to shift more towards soup kitchens and food banks, it's been a lot less successful. So I'm curious to what you think about policy in terms of both just the United States as a whole, as well as specifically for helping out kids in the United States who may not be as, ability to help themselves.
Well, right. I mean, when it comes to kids, as I say, the government does have more of a role in protecting children because kids can't help themselves. And if they have nobody protecting them, then presumably there are also people who are violating their rights. My feeling about school lunch programs is I don't actually believe in school lunch programs. The reason I don't believe in school lunch programs is because I have children. It is the fundamental basis of being a parent that you must feed your child. I will starve before I see my children starve. Honest to God, I will die before I see my children not eat. And any parent who doesn't feel the same is not fit to be a parent. The notion that the government has to step in, that poverty is so grave in the United States that the government has to step in at the tune of $1 a day and pay for a garbage lunch for a kid. If the kid is really suffering from that level of poverty, you have to consider whether the kid really should be in the home. That sounds harsh, but I don't know how else to put it. I mean, the fact is that if a parent cannot provide basic nutrition to a child, I don't know how that child can stay in that home safely. And believe me, their nutrition problems are not going to end with the school lunch program. I mean, there are 2 other meals a day that they need. And it is not supremely expensive to feed your kid oatmeal. I mean, food in the United States is plentiful and cheap. So I really don't know that government is going to necessarily be the solution in all of this. When it comes to children, I have very little sympathy for adults saying they have no capacity to take care of their own children unless they have something, some real serious disability or something. If you're a fully capable adult and you're not taking care of your child, you have committed the gravest sin that you can commit on this earth. And I don't think that government signing a check for a plate of hash browns every day is going to fit that bill.
So I think a major issue that's brought up is the fact that why is there such a high level of connection between obesity as well as connection to places that are having the highest levels of hunger is because the cheapest food that people are able to afford is the most unhealthy, specifically to do with government
Fast
subsidies.
Food, government subsidization of agriculture, that's right, yeah.
Right, so in terms of the fact that now this is the system that we live in, so what would you kind of suggest is the next steps? I mean, saying that every single kid who's living under the poverty line, I mean, the numbers are pretty high. I think even the government recently came up with a statement in 2017, the fact that over 70% of our kids between the age of 17 to 24 are ineligible to serve in the United States military. That's pretty scary.
Oh yeah, obesity is a serious problem. By the way, I will note that is a wide difference from the vast scope of human history, where the problem for poor people was not being too fat, right? The problem for poor people was starvation, and still is for many places in the world. With that said, how do we get better food to people, particularly in food deserts? Right? There are all these areas of the United States where Whole Foods can't survive, or a place a place that sells fresh food can't survive. If we're talking about holistic answers, what you actually need to talk about is solving crime rates, providing more jobs in the community, higher incomes, means ability to buy more things, means more stores opening. But if you're talking about short term, again, charity needs to be the primary solution. And then if that won't solve the problem, then you do have to, here's my hierarchy of helping folks out, right? It has to go something like this. Private charity, followed by local government. Well, it really goes like this. Family, private charity, and private community. Local government, state government, federal government. We've completely reversed that polarity. Now you're not expected to get help from your family or from your church or from your community. You're expected to get it directly from the federal government ASAP, and the federal government, as we've said, is subject to regulatory capture, is subject to lobbying, and is subject to other priorities that don't necessarily mesh with the best needs of the kid.
I think that currently in the system now, it seems to be the opposite.
Thank you. Please make sure to keep questions succinct and 1 question per person. Thank you.
You mentioned freedom of association. You can't force people to hang out with you in the context of the Baker and Jim Crow. But I also know that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 bans race-based discrimination. And I think you would say that that is totally immoral, and I would agree that it's immoral and unacceptable and against the capitalist interests of a business owner. However, what do you think the law should be, and how is that consistent with your opinion on freedom of association?
So I'm perfectly consistent on this. I don't think the law has any role whatsoever in banning race-based discrimination by private actors. I know that's controversial. It shouldn't be controversial in the sense that I think a lot of things are evil, and people engage in evil things every day that I think the government has no business in regulating. I mentioned, for example, decriminalization of marijuana. I am not a fan of marijuana. People who smoke marijuana irritate me. It smells terrible, and you're wasting your life. But do I think the government has a role in prosecuting marijuana use? No, I don't think the government has a role in prosecuting marijuana use. I feel very much the same way about private discrimination because, again, people have the freedom to engage in a lot of activities that I find immoral and bad, and you don't have a right to their services. That's really the question. Do I have a right to your services? My basic answer is no, I don't have a right to your services. Well, if I don't have a right to your services, then I certainly don't have the right to ask the government to compel you to provide me those services. So does that mean that discriminatory people aren't punished by government? Yeah, that's exactly what it means. Discriminatory people aren't punished by government. They are punished by everyone else who won't go to the discriminatory restaurant because they recognize that the discriminatory restaurant discriminates. Right? They are answerable to the market. They are answerable to other people who open the store across the street. You know, people talk about the Woolworths counter boycott in 1960-61. James Meredith, black folks walking into the counter at Woolworths and sitting themselves down and being just physically harmed, physically hurt by racist white people. And that is true. And you know what happened after that happened? Woolworths voluntarily desegregated. Woolworths said, we are going to desegregate because we don't like the bad press. We don't like this. We're going to desegregate. The truth is that companies in the South, including many of the bus companies, wanted to desegregate, but were not allowed to by Jim Crow laws that were on the books. What was great and wonderful about the Civil Rights Act is that it got rid of state-based discrimination. The problem is that it extended it to private discrimination, and there you are now using a moral good as a wedge in order to maximize government power. And this is where I say, like, this is where the sort of Aristotelian notion of government goes wrong. Right? Aristotle famously suggests, well, really Plato. Aristotle's more of a Republican, but Plato suggests the idea of a philosopher king. As in small R Republican, not big R. Plato suggests the idea of a philosopher king, and he suggests that a philosopher king would be the best king, presumably because he'd be able to use all of his power for all of the good things at his disposal. Right, that's true. But I don't believe that there is such a thing as a philosopher king. I believe like the founders did. Men are not angels, men are not devils, men are men. And that means that granting them a power means you also have to recognize that that power can then be turned for something you don't like. So does it sound great, the government banning discrimination on the basis of race? Yeah, that sounds pretty fantastic. It does. The problem is that same exact power can then be used to compel discrimination. It can be used to compel association with which you do not agree. I'm not in favor of giving the government broad-based power to do stuff that I like if that same power can then be used to do stuff that I don't like, and that is a violation of liberty principles.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. I'm curious, what would a university's proper response in dealing with nonviolent hate speech be?
Well, I mean, we have to define hate speech. So one of the big problems with hate speech is that it has a completely fluid definition. Sometimes it just means me saying biological sex exists, and sometimes it means Nazis marching around on campus in rare occasions. So what are we talking about?
So someone drawing something like something racist on a wall, someone deems it like really offensive or maybe violent, but it's not directed toward anyone specifically.
Well, I mean, I think that universities do have a right to determine whether a person is fit to be on their campus, but I'm very leery of saying that racist speech, for example, is a reason to kick somebody off campus. I think it's a dangerous problem. It really runs afoul of First Amendment principles to me. And again, I think people who do that are disgusting and horrible, and I think that that's a bad social strategy if you want to have friends or have a decent life. But I think that if the university starts determining what speech it likes and what speech it doesn't, and then starts banning people based on which speech it likes and which speech it doesn't, that's a pretty dangerous power, and it is a content-based power.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Hi, how are you, Ben? My name's Johnny. I'm here from Michigan State University. Nice.
Guys, don't get violent, or they're going to blame me.
That was more controversial than being a liberal. So my question is, so a 2020 candidate named Andrew Yang has brought up a topic that's big now of universal basic income. And before you destroy it with facts and logic, my question about it is everybody from Martin Luther King Jr. to Milton Friedman has advocated for some form of guaranteed income. And I think you can agree that usually when the government runs things, that maybe they don't end up very good. So if more money was focused on going into the hands of people without restriction, would you be in favor of some form of universal basic income? So
there is a distinction between different types of universal basic income. Sometimes by universal basic income, people just mean that the government is going to sign a check in addition to the current means-tested welfare programs that exist. Sometimes they mean, like Milton Friedman meant, a negative income tax, meaning we get rid of all of the welfare system, and instead we just sign you a flat check. Right? And that flat check basically is going to be for whatever you want it to be for. And I think that the record of universal basic income has not been particularly successful. They tried it in Ontario. They had to stop it because it was incentivizing people not to work. They tried it in Norway. It was also not particularly effective. They had to stop it because it was incentivizing people to be unwilling to work. It's an idea that makes sense only under the supposition that there is a group of legitimate unemployables. And that seems to be the growing perception these days, is that technology is going to take over. There's going to be a permanent underclass of people who simply can't get a job. They're going to be sitting on their butt. They won't literally have a means to live unless we sign them a check. I'm pretty skeptical of that line of economic thought, because that's been said about virtually every major technological development in the history of mankind, is that a new technological development will put an enormous swath of people out of work. That is true temporarily. It is not true permanently. We have effectively permanent full employment in the United States, under 4%. So the notion, and we have 7 million unfilled jobs right now, and people who are not filling them. So I don't really want to incentivize people to not go and get those jobs. If we ever reach the point where there is universal prosperity, to the point where there is no scarcity problem, where it's not a matter of redistributing finite resources, but a matter of resources are plentiful for everyone, then I think that or we reach a point where there's a permanent group of unemployables, as we say, then I think that we'll have no choice but to look at something like universal basic income. I just don't think we're there yet.
Thanks, sir.
This will be the final question.
Hi, Ben. I'm Nick. I'm a sophomore in high school, and I'm a huge fan. How do you think President Trump has affected American politics in the long term, and what do you think American politics will be like post-Trump?
I mean, here's the truth. I think that President Trump is more of an effect than a symptom of American politics. People like to see him as the guy who's pushed us into this vulgar territory in American politics, and then you remember that Barack Obama did an interview with a lady who bathed in Cheerios. And so President Trump is sort of the bizarro Superman version of Barack Obama. Right? Barack Obama was very well spoken, very well kept, also happened to be deeply narcissistic, loved being on TV all the time, would interview in any entertainment context, would show up at the All-Star game, at the Oscars, anywhere he could. And then along comes Trump, and Trump is that, except he's just way more vulgar, and he has worse hair, and all that kind of stuff. And so the notion that Trump has permanently changed politics for the worse, I think that there's some truth to the notion that he has gotten people to accept things they wouldn't otherwise have accepted. So to take an obvious example, I'm old enough to remember when Republicans thought it was very bad when politicians had affairs. Right? That's because I'm more than 3 years old. So Republicans seem to care a lot less about that now because of President Trump. I don't think that's a good thing. I think that there's been a shift in terms of people separating character out from the presidency or from political office, people basically bifurcating the two, now fully embracing the Clintonian argument in 1998 that you can be a wonderful president and also be kind of a crappy human being. And I think that people on the right have basically embraced that for the sake of convenience. I don't think that argument is true. I don't think that argument is going to last, because I don't think that the country really wants more of that in the end. Now, do I hope that they are willing to overlook that long enough to stop Bernie Sanders from being president? Sure. I mean, but at the same time, am I worried about the permanent effect of Trump? Again, I think that Democrats broke the country when it came to the morality issue in high office, and then Trump completed the break. I think that we were already moving in the direction of simplistic, stupid politics before Trump, and I think that has exacerbated under Trump. I think that's largely the effect of the media. I think in some ways Trump has been good, meaning that I think that one of the things that Trump has done that is good is he has violated a bunch of pieties that I think are silly. Like, Trump just says things that he believes, and that's kind of wonderful. He doesn't speak the language of politics that so many people do. He doesn't mince words. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. So would I say that he's done more harm to the social fabric than good? Yeah, I think overall President Trump has done more harm to the social fabric than good. Do I think that the social fabric was deeply destroyed by the time Trump got there? I think that too. I think if you wanted to look at one moment that destroyed American politics, I think that the period 2008 to 2012 fundamentally destroyed the United States in terms of politics. I think that in 2012, when the Democratic Party decided to castigate Mitt Romney, the mildest, most milquetoast human being ever to walk the earth, when they decided to castigate him as a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe who had binders full of women and liked to strap dogs to the top of cars and, in the words of Joe Biden, wanted to put you all back in chains. When they decided to do that to Mitt Romney and then Barack Obama won on that basis, I think it was deeply harmful to politics. And I think it pushed Republicans to a point where they said, you know what, we're not going to go with the milquetoast guy. We'll go to somebody who will at least punch you in the mouth. And I think that that's exactly what happened with President Trump. Now, I think the punching in the mouth is cyclical. I think that there will come a point where we're all punched out and maybe we go back to, okay, can we please have somebody who is not going to be this for 5 minutes. But I think it's going to take a little while for us to get there. And I think that it's, right now, the American people, all of us, are kind of like my 5-year-old daughter when she's fussing, right? She's screaming and she's fussing and she's screaming and she's fussing, and eventually she'll get tired. And when we get tired, then we go back to some semblance of normalcy. But listen, it's a weird time. How can you not look at American politics these days? And every so often you just look up at the TV and you go, whoa, Donald Trump's president. What happened? That's weird. I mean, whether you like him or not, like we definitely went into the wrong timeline from Back to the Future. Somehow Biff placed that bet on the sports book in 1955, and now he runs the hotel, and everything's weird. Eventually, there will be an interest in the weirdness ending, but I think right now that is less likely than more likely. And if we get a Bernie Trump election cycle, at this point, maybe I should just root for entertainment value, honestly. Like, the writers of this season are excellent. As they got in the writers' room, they're like, we're going to pull out all the stops. It's going to be just fantastic. I mean, we're going to have actresses who are paying people to bribe them so their kids can go to college. We're going to, like, bring back the Full House lady. Like, the writers of this season of Trump, it's like season 5 of Trump, excellent, excellent writers. I have to say, the writers' room has really done it. They've justified their presence. Their salary is justified. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.